Painting white subjects in watercolour isn't as difficult as you might think. In this video, I've got lots of tips to share with you. When I first started painting in watercolour, I used to shy away from painting white subjects because I didn't know where to start. How do you paint a white subject on white paper without any white paint? Well, it's not that hard. Here's a few tips that I'll expand on in this video. If you are using a reference photo, you've got to choose it wisely. You can add a background if you want to make the white pop. Or if you're going for a more minimalistic look, you could keep the background white. You don't have to paint it in. Another thing that I like to do is to exaggerate the colours that I see slightly, and I'll be showing you that soon. You can leave the white of the paper showing in the lightest areas, or you can paint a subtle wash of a colour of your choice on the white areas. You don't have to leave the paper white in order to represent white. In this video, I've got some examples of my old paintings to share with you, and I've also painted a simple white rosebud in 3 different colour variations to show you. Before I expand on all of those tips, I'd like to thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes for anyone who loves learning new skills. I've published 13 watercolour classes on Skillshare, and one of them is all about painting a white subject in watercolour. Next month is Inktober, and I was thinking of taking part this year. So to improve my inking skills, or maybe to gain some inking skills is more to the point, I'm taking this class by Roman Muradov called Illustrating with Ink, Techniques for Brush and Pen. Roman is an illustrator and cartoonist, and in this class he shares the materials he uses and some basic brush and nib techniques. I'm learning how to create textures and build up my skills with both a brush and a nib. There are so many different classes you can take on Skillshare on hundreds of topics, from painting in watercolour to photography to learning how to create your own website. The classes on Skillshare are ad-free, so you can stay in the zone while you're exploring new skills. New premium classes are launched each week, and the entire catalogue is now available with subtitles in Spanish, French, Portuguese and German. If you'd like to explore the site, the first 1,000 people to use the link in my description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So go and have a look around, I recommend it. Okay, back to my first tip. If you are using a reference photo, choose it wisely. I have found that whenever I take a photo of a white subject, it's best not to take it in strong light. I also find I have to look hard at my subject to see all of the variations in the colours and tonal values. And I try to look for reflected colours to add interest to my painting. This cockatoo landed on our roof in the middle of the day, and the whites are all washed out. There's not much there for me to work with. Whereas this one that was taken in the same spot but with softer light gives me a lot more detail to work with. The white areas aren't as washed out and I can see more. I feel like I'd have more success if I used this reference photo rather than the first one. Tip 2. When I paint a white subject, I tend to look a little closer at all of the subtle colour variations than I normally do when I'm painting a coloured subject, because they may not be as obvious. And I also look for reflected colours. I took this photo of some gardenias in our garden, and you can see the green of the leaves reflected on the petals. I'd make sure that I included those green areas to make my painting more interesting. And I'd also look really closely at the subtle variations in the tonal values and colours. I can see some warm yellows in there as well as some greys. Tip 3, you can add a background in if you want to make the white pop, or you don't have to paint it in at all. This is a painting I did for my patrons on Patreon. With this one, I painted in a dark background to emphasise the rose, but I could have painted it without the background. With these birds here, I painted in a soft wash on the background. I think if I was to paint this one again, I'd try to be a bit bolder with the background. To add interest to this gardenia, I added a colourful cast shadow. And on these flannel flowers, I left the background white for simplicity. Tip 4. I am one to exaggerate colours that I see to make my paintings more interesting. And I try to make use of what I know about colour theory. Here's a quick study I did of two ducks. With this painting, I used a complementary colour scheme of violet and yellow, and I mixed my greys from them. On this snowy owl, I went for a cool colour scheme of blues and violets, with a little pop of yellow in the eye to add a touch of warmth. The colours you choose will depend on your subject and the mood that you're trying to convey. Think of white as being either cool or warm, and either intensely bright or more soft and muted. If you want a super bright white, leave the white of the paper showing and surround those white areas with some colours, like I did with the flannel flowers. If you're looking for a softer, more subdued painting, cover areas of the white subject with a diluted wash of colour. Instead of leaving the white of the paper showing on the flannel flowers, I could have painted a really pale wash of something like raw sienna over them, or pale wash of violet over them if I wanted more of a cool colour scheme. Lots of the colours I have on my palette could represent white, as long as I dilute the colour with lots of water. This is Windsor Violet. I use a small amount of paint and I mix lots of water with it. This very pale blush of violet could represent white on a painting. The next colour on my palette is Permanent Rose. I do the same thing. I mix water with it to make it very pale. And a blush of this cool colour could represent white as well. I can use most of the colours on my palette the same way. This colour here is Scarlet Lake. Transparent orange, cobalt blue, French ultramarine, transparent yellow, burnt sienna. Here I've mixed green from cobalt blue and transparent yellow, and the colour down here is raw sienna. All of those colours and many more, if you thin them down with water like I showed you, they could represent white. So don't always think that you have to leave the white of the paper showing in order to represent white. To demonstrate how I use different colours, I've painted a simple white rosebud in 3 different colour variations. I used the same colours on each rose, but I varied the amount of pigment that I used. I changed the ratios to get 3 variations. I chose a triadic colour scheme using Winsor & Newton colours. Winsor Blue Red Shade, Permanent Rose and Winsor Lemon. The paper I used was Arches Cold Press. With the first rose, I decided to paint it in pretty much the way I saw it. You can see my reference photo there. So here I'm wetting the main cup of the rose with some water. I'll work on wet paper to keep all the paint edges soft. To make a grey, I mixed the 3 colours together. I made a violet with the Permanent Rose and the Winsor Blue, and then I mixed a touch of yellow into that. I had to keep adjusting it until I got it the way I wanted it. Then I went back to the blue, put a bit more blue in it. I'm only using a small amount of paint at a time. A bit more blue. I need to make sure it's thinned with water as well so that it's not too dark. Then, using the reference photo as a guide, I paint that colour onto the wet paper where I see some subtle shadows on that petal. As I said, I'm painting on the wet paper because I want soft paint edges. The paint bleeds over the wet paper, it creeps and gives me those soft edges. All I do is place the paint where I want it, and I let the water and the paint do their thing as much as possible. I try not to fuss with it. I can see a darker shadow running down this right-hand side here. I could have also painted a really soft wash of something like raw sienna over the top of this petal. Then I see a little bit of warmth on the reference photo. So I drop a bit of the yellow in there while that grey is wet. Then I wet this other petal. I did the same thing. I used the grey mixture on the wet paper. I left quite a bit of the white of the paper showing. I wanted a brown, so I got a bit of permanent rose and I mixed a tiny bit of yellow and a tiny bit of blue with it. The main colour is permanent rose. And I used that colour just here where I saw it was a bit browner on the reference photo. And as you can see, I'm keeping everything pale at this stage. I painted in the top of that petal the same way, and then I dried it off. There was a little turned over section that I painted on the dry paper there. And there's a little crease just here that I can see it's slightly darker, so I painted some more of that grey there. This darker section in here I painted in with the grey on dry paper. I took the paint out of my brush and used the damp brush to fill in the bottom section of it to make it lighter. And then I dropped in some blue and a little bit of yellow to green it down slightly. I painted in that petal on the left-hand side on the wet paper. I left a bit of the white of the paper showing. And then I painted in the sepals with the grey as well on the dry paper. I painted in the other petals the same way on the wet paper and leaving the white of the paper showing in places. I added the cast shadow there on dry paper. I've wet this petal again to paint in a shadow along there. And now I'll deepen the colour on this cast shadow by painting over it on the dry paper. Here I'm using my damp brush to soften that edge a bit more. I re-wet this outer petal with some water. I've got some more of that grey mixture and I'm deepening the shadow that's on that one. I wet it with water because I wanted soft paint edges on the cast shadow. I dropped in a bit of yellow there as well. Then I noticed there was a shadow up here that had hard edges, so I painted that area there on the dry paper and joined it up with the wet shadow. I also deepened the colour here slightly. I had to look really hard at the reference photo to see that it was slightly darker there. And I softened the edge of the paint with my damp brush. Here I'm wetting this petal at the top with some water. I can see that it's slightly darker there on the reference photo. I've got some more of my grey paint. I paint that on the wet paper there. That helps to bring out the top edge of that petal below. I let the paint bleed over the paper. Just push it where I want it. And then I used my smaller brush then to paint a little bit of detail at the top where I saw that it was slightly darker. I painted that on dry paper and then I used my damp brush to soften away paint edges. There's another one here, I can see a little shadow. And over here as well. For the stem and the sepals, I mixed some Winsor lemon into Winsor blue. To make it look a little more natural, I put a tiny bit of the permanent rose into it to dull it down slightly. A little bit more yellow. And I use that lighter colour to paint in the stem. I added a little more blue to the mixture, and then while that was wet, I painted that down the left-hand side. I painted that green on this sepal here, in the middle of it, around the edge. The paper's dry, and I ran it down the edge of this one as well. and then I dried it, re-wet it with water, and I deepened the colour in the darkest areas. I mixed some more green, this time with more pigment, still using the 3 colours. There's the first example done. Now I'll paint the second rose, but this time I'll use a complementary colour scheme of violet and yellow. I'll use the same colours that I used. That's the grey that I mixed before, but this time I want it more violet. So I'll mix some more blue and some more of the permanent rose into it. This is a permanent rose. I mix the two together. Now I think I'll put a bit of Windsor lemon in that as well. Just a tiny bit to take the edge off it so that it's not too bright. And I do the same thing with this one. I wet each petal with water. I paint the violet mixture on where I see it slightly darker on the reference photo. I leave the white of the paper showing where I want it to be white. On that petal on the left that I painted in, I dropped some yellow on there as well while the violet was wet. I'll do that here on this one as well. The violet's still wet. I paint some yellow in there. This petal here is quite light. There's hardly any shadows on it at all. There's a cast shadow right at the top, but the rest of it is quite pale. So I've wet it with water and I've got a little bit of colour on there, not a lot. I've left most of the white of the paper showing on this one. I painted in the back petal and I allowed this one to dry. And now I'm painting in that cast shadow that's on this one. Still using the violet mixture. Paper's dry. And before that paint dries, I get a bit more pigment on my brush. And I deepen the colour down here where I see it's a bit darker on the reference photo. I painted in the leaves the same way I did the other one, and then I noticed a little cast shadow right down the bottom here that I painted in on dry paper. With the third rose, I thought I'd paint a cooler colour scheme with a hint of warmth. So for this one, I again decided on a complementary colour scheme, but this time I'll use blue and orange as the main colours. I'm still using the same 3 pigments, but I'll mix them in different ratios this time. I've gone back to more of a neutral grey. I'm painting on wet paper again, and I'll leave some of the paper showing. And here I've picked up a bit of the Windsor blue. I paint it on and spread it out. I can't see this on the reference photo, but I know that this is the colour scheme I want. So where I see grey on the reference photo, I can use blue. As long as I keep all my colours pale. Here on this petal, I've added a bit of orange. I mixed some of the permanent rose with the yellow. More yellow than the permanent rose though. I can't see any orange there on the reference photo, but I wanted to make a complementary colour scheme. And I also wanted to add a little bit of warmth to the cool temperature. It's always best to let one temperature dominate though. So in this case it will be a cool rose, but it will have a touch of warmth on it here and there. On this petal on the left hand side, I decided to add a bit more impact to it and deepen the blue that I had on there. So I wet it with water and I got some more of the Windsor blue and I painted that on. Bolder this time. I added a bit more blue onto this shadow here. I wet the paper first though. So what I'm trying to do is increase the contrast. Deepened that little shadow down in there as well. Took the paint out of my brush, softened that edge away at the front. And for warmth, I added a bit more orange there. When I had finished all of them, I could see that I needed to deepen the green colour. So again, I mixed some green from the blue and the yellow. And I put a touch of permanent rose in it again to make it a bit more natural looking. I used plenty of pigment though, a lot less water this time. And I used that colour on the deepest, darkest sections of the stem and the sepals. And that helped to add more contrast to each rose. So there you can see the 3 different colour schemes. And I wasn't a slave to the reference photo. I used it as a guide, but I didn't follow it exactly as I saw it. So there's one white rose painted in 3 different colour schemes using a limited palette. I encourage you to play around with your colours and experiment with what you have. Don't always feel that you have to match colours exactly as you see them. Create something new, something exciting. Don't merely copy what you see. Transform it into something new. Challenge yourself to use a limited palette and you'll be surprised with what you can produce. I hope there was something useful in there for you. Thank you for watching. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I'll be back next week. I'll see you then. Painting white subjects in watercolour isn't, no, I'll say that again because I'm not saying white. When I first started, before I expand on all of those tips, gain my inking skills. Roman is an illustrator and cartoonist. He's a cartoonist. If I used this reference photo rather than because there may not be. With this one, I painted in the dark background on this snowy owl, but I varied the amount of pigment. Gonna do that again.